Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 12 major composers who were mediocre orchestrators. Yes, well, this is an interesting list. It really is. I say mediocre advisedly and carefully and selectively because if I said crappy, then, the hysteria that I know would ensue. But mediocrity is a little bit less controversial. And the fact is that most composers who write for the orchestra manage to get their ideas across one way or another. And so I think mediocre is the right term. They could have done better. Right? I mean, that's fair. And there's evidence for that. It's a relatively objective quality in many respects. So let's look through this list of interesting people and see where we wind up. Robert Schumann, well, he's like the locus classicus, right? For the classical composer who's just not a very good orchestrator. Some people argued, well, it's better than it sounds, or it sort of works. It does. And he wasn't equally bad in all aspects of the orchestrator's art. His writing for the horn is wonderful. Horn players love him. The problem with Schumann is that he was a crappy conductor. That seems to be unquestioned. And in his own music, he just doubled everything in order to make entrances foolproof. In other words, if the woodwinds had an entrance, he doubled them with the strings. And it got worse as he got older, not better. He didn't learn from experience. His best scoring is his earliest, the Spring Symphony and, that sort of stuff. And then when you get to the Rhenish and the revision of the fourth, it gets more and more clogged up. The Rhenish is a particular problem. And that led many people to rescore his music. Mahler, George Szell, who defended him vociferously while rewriting it extensively in places, that it just needs a little help for clarity's sake, and particularly so that it has the color of the woodwind section, because as I pointed out 100 billion times, great orchestration begins and largely ends with the handling of the woodwind section. That's how you color an orchestra vividly. And, Schumann just didn't have it. It's okay. I mean, he still had beautiful moments, but he was mediocre at best. Brahms is another one. Now, Brahms is a very different case because Brahms was so obsessive compulsive and did everything, polished and refined. And it's hard to believe that somebody could be so polished and refined and still achieve such uninteresting results. But Brahms managed to do that. At the very beginning of his career, we know that he sucked at orchestration because he needed Joachim's help with things like the first piano concerto and stuff like that. There were all kinds of issues with balance and color and whatnot. And Brahms actually understood how to do colorful stuff because the first two serenades actually were the works in which he learned how to write for woodwinds. And he did it very well. He really did. So you kind of wonder what happened. Well, I'll tell you what happened. What happened is that Brahms had a very, very specific and somewhat austere concept of symphonic orchestration. He did, and it involved limited use of brass, limited use of timpani, no concerto-like solo things for any extensive periods of time. I mean, it's even hard to find a trill in his orchestral music. It's really stripped down. And often it's lovely when it needs to be, but when he's trying to write his big climaxes and things, he could get pretty clogged up. I mean, the classic one is the climax of the finale in the Third Symphony, which is a fabulous climax. It's just marvelous. It's the brass come in with the da 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 dum bum ba dum bum ba, and then you've got the yum ba dum ba bum ba bum. And the woodwinds were squealing at the top, and the which really needs timpani there, which Toscanini added. There are the finale, the big chorale climax at the finale of the First Symphony, which so many people reorchestrated to make a little bit fuller and bigger. Brahms knew what he was doing. But there's a question about whether his innate sense of humility, his unwillingness to make a big statement, his desire not to be grandiose, gets the better of him, because his musical vision is great, and a little grander wouldn't have hurt. It really wouldn't have. His Fourth Symphony, I think he got it all just about right, most of the time. For the most part. The Passacaglia, well, it could have a few extra doodads in it, maybe. But essentially, if you look at a Brahms score, it's very, very interesting. Every movement is written for a defined ensemble, whether it's the full orchestra or a stripped-down version, as in his middle movements, where the trumpets and drums often go away or whatever. And there's sort of a rule, which is that the final chord of every movement must contain every instrument in that movement. It's not 100%. I mean, nothing ever is in the world of classical music. But most of the time, you see that Brahms is imagining things for certain specific groups of instruments, and he feels this need to make every note matter. It's really like chamber music. It really is. I mean, the concept is a chamber music concept where every note matters and every part is necessary. But the problem is, of course, that the orchestra is not a chamber ensemble, and it gets to do more, and it wants to do more, and we should have an opportunity to hear it do more. So, it's a failing. It's a failing, but is it a huge one? Well, maybe not so much. Busoni. Busoni is a really interesting composer. I mean, everyone thinks he's really interesting. He's like a lot of pianist composers who never quite get the hang of writing for the orchestra. His orchestration is gray. That's the only way to describe it. It just lacks color. He has all kinds of instruments. He'll use percussion. He has no inhibitions about what he does. And I mean, look at his piano concerto, which is just this, that huge with chorus and craziness, and it's endless. And he has a bigness of vision, but his sense of color is just off. It's also true in his operas, and Turandot and Die Brautwahl and these other things. He just didn't have a vivid sense of orchestral color. Maybe because he didn't write enough orchestral music. I don't know. But when you listen to it all, there is this sort of gray feeling to it, this lack of vividness that eventually begins to wear on you. Another composer who was very interesting, actually, who was a sort of so-so orchestrator, was Tippett. Michael Tippett, who, I think is a wonderful composer, wrote fabulous music. The interesting thing about Tippett is that, contemporary composers particularly are all supposed to be great orchestrators, and a lot of them are just brilliant. And there's really no excuse not to be, because, you study orchestration, there's orchestration classes, you have these fabulous orchestras to write for, there's lots of opportunities to get your music performed, and you get to hear it, and you can revise it, and all that fun stuff, Modern composers who are not good orchestrators are rare, and interesting cases. Some of them are great, some of them are just pedantic and uninteresting. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. But Tippett struggled, and the struggle is part of his music. It was a sort of Beethovenian neoclassicism, which is where he started with pieces like the First Symphony and the Concerto for Double String Orchestra and things like that. And also his music was vividly contrapuntal. Lots of stuff happening, lots of notes. And so clarity is an issue. I mean, it really is. There's the Corelli Fantasia for strings, the Vision of St. Augustine. It's sort of this middle period where he really starts to overwrite things. And there are all these competing lines, and it can get a little foggy in places. Eventually, he developed quite a distinctive sound, but even there, he could misjudge things. I mean, if you look at his scores, they're full of shades of color that don't quite come off well. The very opening of the Fourth Symphony, with its wind machine or breathing effects and all this, it doesn't quite work. You know what his concept is, but the realization sometimes ventures into the realm of the almost ridiculous. So Tippett is an interesting case, I think. Mussorgsky is simply a case of simply lack of practice and education. I mean, he just didn't have the technique. I mean, he didn't have the opportunity to gain the technique. He didn't have a chance. He was self-taught and, spent very little time writing orchestral works or listening to them. He had few opportunities to hear them. He was spending most of his time drinking. I mean, for whatever reason, his orchestration is not good. I know some people swear by the original version of Boris Godunov. I do. I think it's really nifty, in its sort of gaunt sobriety. But oh goodness gracious, it could really use some change of color in places. Rimsky-Korsakov, people piss all over him because he gussied up Mussorgsky, but it needed it. Shostakovich did the same thing. We don't hear Shostakovich's version of Boris Godunov or Chovanshchina, but Shostakovich did them both, and he also felt that they needed help. There's just misjudgments all over the place, bad balances and awkwardness, and awkwardness is not always a good thing. Sometimes it's a sign of originality, of rawness, of edge, and sometimes it's just incompetence. And in Mussorgsky, it's sort of we're skirting the edge there. Chopin. Well, who can blame Chopin? I mean, he wrote so little orchestral music, didn't he? He really did. And even Tovey defended the orchestration of his piano concertos by saying, well, with the exception of a solo of trombone, which is totally unnecessary, you can leave out entirely, it's a perfectly fine accompaniment to his piano writing. Well, that's true. And that's all it ever is. Chopin writes accompaniments to the piano. He writes nothing for the orchestra that shows off the orchestra. Well, maybe there's that one horn call. What is it, at the end of the second concerto, or the first one that goes do-ba-da-doo, do-ba-da-doo, do. It's okay. I'll give it to him. But no. You wonder listening to that music what the wind section is doing there. I mean, what is it for? Why have one? It might as well just be strings, and when you need a climax, add a drum going thwap, No, but like I said, it wasn't his deal anyway, so he gets a pass. But we have to acknowledge that it wasn't very good. And the interesting thing is that his teacher was Kalkbrenner, I believe. Others saw these pieces and seemed to think that there was, they didn't need to comment, which is kind of shocking. Another contemporary composer who was terrible and got worse, Peter Maxwell Davies. Maxwell Davies fascinates me because as an earlier avant-garde guy, he was really interesting, but he was mostly writing for chamber ensembles of various, unusual constituency. So he could be quite vivid in his sense of color. But afterwards, as he got into his symphonic phase, the Strathclyde concertos, Strathclyde, that's what they were called, the Strathclyde concertos, and even his string quartets, the Naxos quartets that he wrote, that's, talk about gray, busy, uninteresting, drab. It's like the slate gray sky of the Orkney Islands in which he lived. If you want a slate gray, I love slate gray skies, by the way. When November happens, and you get those wonderful chill autumn days with the slate gray sky, the cool weather, I think it's fabulous. It's one of my favorite times of the year. But the nicest thing about it is that it's over very shortly. So you get all kinds of other colored skies the rest of the day, the rest of the year, the rest of other months, other weeks. It's a beautiful effect. It's not something to hang your hat on and live by. Oh, no. Okay. Thank you, Finster. What do you think of Peter Maxwell Davies? Yeah. See, she doesn't like him either. There we go. Hey, you want to say hello? Here, say hi to everybody. Hi. So Maxwell Davies definitely doesn't get my vote. I think his orchestration's dreadful. Liszt. Well, Liszt, we all know that Liszt needed help with his orchestration. Raff helped him, and some other folks who were hanging around there at the time gave him some assistance. Peter Cornelius, maybe, and that was fine. There's nothing wrong with asking for help if you need help. The trouble with Liszt's orchestration, even when it's done by other people, is that it always sounds like a trombone. You always, you notice the tone poems and all that stuff. When the trombones come in, everything sounds trombone-y. And so does, stuff when the trombones aren't playing, it sounds trombone-y. It's very, very, there's a certain, I don't know, what's the word? It's crassness, maybe. He uses fabulous orchestral effects. He was a master of effect. He used percussion. He used tam-tam. He used, he does a lot of writing for woodwinds that's nice, and, his devilish stuff, devilish laughter, or the clarinets, stuff like that. But when he has to write a tutti, when he has to write for the full orchestra and create a big, sonorous, lovely sound, he just doesn't manage it somehow. Maybe the problem is that when he was in Weimar, they had to rehearse in a room that was like the size of your living room. So he'd have like 60 instruments all in this little tiny room, and they would all have, I keep getting messages. Oh, those are notifications that the Metro North train system is experiencing delays, in case you're curious. But really, it's fascinating that there's just so much, it sounds compacted and kind of screechy. It really does. Now, it can be played well. It can be made to sound well. All right, you're done? You're going to take a nap? I don't blame you. It can be made to sound well. It's really about performance, right? You can give it a much more voluptuous or rounded or attractive sonority with intelligent conducting, and, good. That's what those guys are there for. It's what they do. It's their job to make it sound great, but it doesn't make your job easy. It really doesn't. And over the long haul, it works like the Faust Symphony, the Dante Symphony, these, the Ce qu'on entend sur la montagne, the longer symphonic poems. It can become wearisome. And when he really cuts loose with the brass, it's like, oh boy, here we go. So yeah, Liszt is an issue. Scriabin. A lot of you folks have been jumping up and down about Scriabin on these lists because, he was like the greatest revolutionary, and he was that because he had, the chord thing. And Scriabin, people think, somebody wrote a really nasty comment saying, I just don't like him because he has a cult and all this stuff. I think Scriabin's marvelous, and I think he got better as he went. I really do. I think he was a composer with a hermetically sealed style. So, while he may have evolved, I think the fact that people don't usually mention him in talking about the evolution of music and the universe sort of speaks for itself, doesn't it? Let's just not exaggerate, his significance. He was a wonderful composer for the piano. As an orchestrator, oh, no. The first three symphonies, it's chromatic sludge city. He's post-Wagnerian, string heavy. You can like it because of its, richness and decadence and that heavy, thick miasma of suffocating harmony that, that suffocates nicely. And again, I like these works. But that doesn't mean you have to admire everything uncritically, or you have to make claims for it that can't be sustained by any reasonable, sort of fund of logic. And then when Scriabin got to like the Poem of Ecstasy and Prometheus and that stuff, it all just becomes a clogged up mess. It's a fun clogged up mess, granted. It really is. But the Poem of Ecstasy with the screamy trumpet, just as soon as it gets going, it's yeah, da 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 da. If that drives you crazy when I do it, well, listen to the work itself. I have the score, and of course, and I've played it, and it just needs clarity. It just needs clarity. And he writes fabulous tam-tam parts. I'm all for it. But gosh darn it, can't he just somehow decide which musical line should stand out other than the trumpet in the Poem of Ecstasy anyway? So yeah, Scriabin is another pianist composer who was able to get the job done for what he wanted, but he wasn't anything special. I mean, who are we kidding? All right. William Schuman, the American composer, not Robert. Bill Schuman, not Schumann. Schumann. He was a Schumann. And oh, his orchestration is so uninteresting. Talk about, it's layered. It's layered in a way that's 100% predictable. I mean, if it's slow and quiet, it's all strings. And as it gets going a bit, well, maybe he'll throw in the woodwinds. And then finally the brass come in playing, their like jazzy rhythm things, and the percussion will emphasize the rhythm underneath it, and you get some rim shots tossed in there. Oh my God, it's horrible. It's just terrible. I remember hearing his string symphony. I thought I was going to throw myself off the balcony of Carnegie Hall. So I know some of you would say I should have done it, but it is so colorless. Now, granted, in a string ensemble, I mean, you need to work to make it colorful. But, couldn't he have written a single pizzicato? Couldn't he have done something, to enlarge the range of it or something to make it sound just not like an endless monotony of dissonant, clogged up harmony? And the symphonies aren't any better because they sound like the string symphony, except when they get louder, he just tosses on these other layers of instrumentation. I think he's totally formulaic. I know some people love him. We've had this conversation before, but I find his orchestration, at least, to be totally formulaic and uninteresting. Another totally formulaic orchestrator was Messiaen, but Messiaen was an interesting composer, and the formulaicness of his formulaicosity, whatever, of his orchestration suits what he's doing, and he knows how to deploy it. And he also wrote for interesting ensembles, throughout his career. I mean, the constituents are interesting, even if the way he applies things is kind of standardized. But William Schuman, nah, absolutely not. And there's another one, the English composer, Edmund Rubbra. Mr. Rubbra. Yeah, Rubbra. Oh, my gosh. I mean, there's a guy who really had issues with orchestration and who was a symphonist. I find that fascinating. He thought in orchestral terms, but not in orchestral colors. His first couple of symphonies are dire. I mean, I enjoy them. I mean, they're argumentatively, they're symphonics. He was also a major contrapuntist. I think that was his problem, actually, because he never quite figured out how to be both a contrapuntist and an orchestral composer. We see that with Brahms also, and some of these people, they don't get that the orchestra is a different beast when you're writing contrapuntal music. See, one composer who understood that, if you want to have an example of how to write good contrapuntal music for the orchestra, is Beethoven's Consecration of the House Overture. Because the whole main body of the overture is this giant double fugue. And, he was trying to emulate Handel. And Beethoven had no problem. For all of his issues, he was deaf, and he had that, and his orchestration is notoriously difficult in terms of balance. But he understood that when you're writing for the orchestra, you don't have to worry about like doubling things, and you just do it. And somehow he managed to make it work. Rubbra got better. Rubbra, however you pronounce it, got better as he got older. Starting with basically the Fifth Symphony, the Sixth Symphony, which is a masterpiece. The later works, they're also very dense sounding, in my opinion, but he got the clarity also that he wanted. I think later on there are lovely works. I mean, they really are, but orchestrally, they have issues. They really do. And last but not least, the most mediocre orchestra of all the great composers was J.S. Bach. Now, in the Baroque period, orchestration really wasn't a thing yet, because the orchestra wasn't quite a thing yet. The orchestra was essentially strings and continuo, and then anything else was a solo, in concerto terms, or you had three trumpets and timpani all playing together all the time. Bach was interesting in that his music is difficult because he wrote for everything the same. I mean, he was a keyboard guy. He wrote keyboard music. He thought everybody should be able to do the same thing, and he just didn't care. So the voices, the brass, the winds, Everything got the same stuff. Now, this is fabulous if you're the world's greatest contrapuntist, right? Because everyone's got to play the same stuff one way or another. And if you're writing out all the ornamentation as well, or most of it, but he was really uninterested in, I think, in the specific technique and coloristic capabilities of a lot of the instruments he used. Certainly when playing together, which they very seldom did, because they were mostly concertos for solos. But it's a very interesting thing because Bach's music, as people have said, and again, it's not a defect particularly, it's just a fact, exists independently of whatever medium he chose for it. He could write it as a chorus. He could make it a piano or a harpsichord solo. He could do a concerto movement. He did that all the time. He turned one thing into another. The actual color was just, it was like today I'll wear this jacket, tomorrow I'll put on that pair of shoes. It didn't matter because the music itself was so strong and so independently based on all of the essential musical facts of composition that whatever he chose to do with it was going to work. You just had to be able to play it. And that didn't concern him so much, or sing it. Goodness gracious. Do you really think those boy sopranos were able to sing all that stuff the way Bach wrote it? No wonder he was always screaming at them and carrying on and going crazy with his little miserable choir at St. Thomas's Church in Leipzig. Yeah, he never was satisfied because he was unsatisfiable, I think, when it came to that sort of thing. So yes, Bach's orchestration is to the extent that it is orchestration at all, is sui generis, let's just say, and pretty mediocre. There are all kinds of issues with it. And that's one of the reasons that people take his harpsichord concertos and try and turn them back into their original forms as works for solo instruments. And that's why we know what the solo instruments were, because the keyboard writing is often so idiomatic. It's an interesting case. Let's just put it that way. And so that is my list of the 12 major composers who are mediocre orchestrators. You may want to add some. Feel free. Be specific. Tell us what by them really strikes you as like, ugh. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.